Shirley Berman, May the 5th, 1996, recording Elliott Gluck speaking about exceptional endeavors during World War II.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, how do you introduce somebody whom everybody in the audience knows? Elliott Gluck was born in Ottawa, raised in Ottawa, was a graduate of Glebe High School, went off to Queen's to get a BCom, and then trotted off to Winnipeg to work for the Hudson's Bay Company. He didn't stay there very long. He came back into the family business, as all good Jewish boys should do. But a year or so after he came back to Premier Hat Shops in 1939, some other things started happening which intervened in his life at the time. He enrolled in the Canadian Officers Training Corps in September 1940, was commissioned in May of 42, and served in Canada and abroad with the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps on a very nice, ostensibly very nice, expenses paid around various countries, paid by His Majesty, of course. But while all this was going on, he did manage to find the time to marry his wife Nell, and in 6 years later they had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. 2 daughters, I'm sorry, 2 daughters, I beg your pardon, I was given sons-in-law. My source of information let me down. Well, anyway, I said my source let me down. Peace didn't end his association with the armed forces, however. He remained a militia officer until he retired in 1965, and at one time was commanding the Company Number 130 of the Service Corps. But he did, at that time, re-enter the family business, where he remained, as I was told this time, from 1946 until 1970. And then he joined Ottawa's largest employer, the Fed, of course, in the form of Statistics Canada, and he stayed there until he retired around 1983. But simply reaching the official retiring age didn't stop Elliott. A duplicate bridge obviously wasn't enough to occupy all his time. He promptly went to work again, this time as a consultant to both government and to industry. Well, if his life could be called a study in the use of time, he's now set out to look at time in a rather different perspective, in a new and rather different career as a historical researcher. He's worked on several projects related to the Ottawa Jewish Archives, and tonight he's going to speak to us on the Ottawa Jewish community in a particular context, the exceptional efforts that they made during the Second World War. Ladies and gentlemen, Elliott Gluck.
Having just discovered 2 new sons, I'm going to take a little while to get used to it. Can everybody hear me without the mic? No? I'm not really fussy about a mic, but I'll use it. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here. The subject I'm going to talk about is one that has been very dear to my heart for many years, and in fact, a number of you have heard me expound on it ad infinitum and ad nauseum. But tonight we'll try to bring out a few facts and a few things about the activity of the Ottawa Jewish community that you may not be aware of. What I'm particularly interested in is to bring everything out in the open and talk about things that either we've forgotten about or that in fact the younger generations don't know. And I'm glad to see a number of people in the audience who are in the younger generation, which means anybody below 70. And also a number of people who are not native Ottawans, that is, they haven't been here for more than 50 years, and that makes them still visitors. But we'll try to tie up all the activities that I think make this community a unique one in its efforts during World War II. Before I start, I'd like to make two things clear. First of all, I am not talking about my own personal experiences or my own opinions about matters. I've been very careful to use documented material from either the National Archives, National Library, or the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society's archives. And the documentation at the back comprises most of the things that I will talk about tonight. If anybody has any questions about them, I'll welcome the questions at the end of the session. Not only that, time will not allow me to mention all the names that I would have liked to mention. So please don't feel offended if I mention some names and don't mention the name of anybody who's particularly near and dear to you. It wasn't a question of oversight, it was a question of time. So please accept my apologies beforehand and let it go at that. I'd like to thank Shirley Berman and Don Logan particularly. Don and Shirley have been invaluable in picking up material for me as I required it, and they usually answered at the snap of my fingers. Either that or I yelled at them, so it worked out pretty well. But they are both very capable people technically and professionally, and I would very, very much like to make sure that you all know that their services are available, and Shirley's ad in the bulletin this week tells a great deal. Don't throw it out. Give us a shout. If you've got material that you think relates to the Ottawa Jewish community that would be of interest, please let us have a look at it, because we need more material in order to preserve our history, and it is our history. I'd also like to thank two volunteers who I recruited at the various Saturday services of Machziki Hadass, Izzy Litwack and Bill Kahansky, who were of great help and invaluable aid in sorting out the roster of service personnel during World War II, and also in identifying the families that I'm going to talk about later. We did have difficulty identifying the families simply because when it came to a group like the Greenbergs, there were 4 Greenbergs, I think, I Greenbergs, and none of us could simply identify the I's, the A's, and the B's. So we'll have to look to the members of the community to give us further information or more detailed information about that sort of thing. Every year on Remembrance Day, we have ceremonies in the various synagogues. Generally, what we do is we have a speaker and we read the names of the persons, the men killed overseas. It's a very touching moment, and it's something that means a great deal to the veterans. But it doesn't mean as much, I'm sorry to say, to the people who simply weren't old enough to understand what was going on at the time, and who don't have the memories that we have of those young men. They didn't have a chance to grow up and grow old like we did, and remembering them then is a very beautiful gesture, but it's not enough. We have to know, and we have to talk about their position in the community's efforts, and remind us all and make a permanent record of what we did in the community. As a veteran, I've talked a great deal to my children, my grandchildren, about my particular role, and I've done this from a very personal point of view, obviously. It's hard for me to talk about anything about myself. It's hard enough for me to talk about anything about myself at any time, and in this case, I certainly have spent a great deal, very many pleasant hours talking to my grandsons about those times. But we need to know not only what we did, we need to know what everybody did in the community, and I hope you'll find what I talk about in the community interesting. The first thing I want to talk about is our participation in the armed forces, Then I want to talk about the community's participation in the war effort. And then I want to talk about a very special organization called A Few of the Jewish Ladies of Ottawa. More about that later. Participation. The Ottawa Jewish community turned out in record numbers to enlist in the armed forces. We had personnel in every one of the services: Navy, Army, Air Force, Wrens, Quacks, WAFs, Merchant Marine, Nursing Auxiliary. We had them in every single one. And one thing I better make clear right now, because we did have a reasonable representation of ladies, female personnel, however a feminist wants to refer to it. We did have a number of Jewish girls from Ottawa in the various services. Unfortunately, the statistics that I'm going to talk about now didn't separate men from ladies, and therefore my comparisons as far as statistics go relate only to the male participation. It just wasn't possible to provide what I considered accurate enough information about female participation to allow it to take place. Anyhow, what did we do? First of all, I'd like to mention World War I, because we did participate, to my great surprise, since very few of us have ever learned very much about Jewish participation in World War I. We did participate at a very high rate. During the war, there was a series put out by the Canadian government called Canadians All, and it dealt with a number of things of interest to the general public in connection with the ongoing war at that time. And in the August edition, 1941, of Canadians All, this was what the author had to say about Canadian Jews. Our Jews in Canada are conscientious, industrious, and loyal citizens. Their devotion to Canada was amply demonstrated in the last war. While the percentage of male Canadians of all origins, 21 years of age and over, was 31.02%, the figure for Canada's Jews stands much higher at 37.81. So we can hold our heads high on the basis of that participation. How did we do in World War II? Well, that's what the flip chart is here for. Now again, I was unable to get accurate percentages on total participation of the general population, so these remarks relate only to Jewish participation. World War I, all Canada 31.02, and Jewish Canadians 37.8. World War II, of all Canadian Jewish males eligible to enlist, 35.62 enlisted. Ottawa Jews, the Ottawa Jewish males who were eligible, enlisted at the rate of 43.4%. When I did these figures, I took the age groups in the census from 15 to 44. So it was impossible to come out more accurately than that percentage, but if anything, I think the percentage is a little bit high. One of the things that surprised me in doing this research was that the roster of service personnel, which had been prepared in 1946 by the B'nai B'rith, Ottawa Lodge 885, which listed something like 470 service people, still managed to miss a reasonable number of those people, and I simply don't know why. I hope when my research is completed to turn over my records to the Ottawa Post of the Jewish War Veterans of Canada to see if they can complete a more comprehensive list to make sure that the list that we use of Jewish servicemen in World War II is as complete as possible. In fact, I found out tonight that one member of the audience is not listed, and I know that he was overseas as much as I was. enough about participation, because those figures stand out for themselves. As I went over the various documents and looked at this 25th anniversary booklet of the B'nai B'rith chapter, the Ottawa Lodge, I was struck, as I have been over the years, by the fact that a large number of Ottawa Jewish families contributed either all their sons or all their eligible sons, or in the case of a large number of families, their only sons. Now, we're all aware that in Jewish tradition and Jewish history, the family has been the basic unit. And I think that the fact that we have so many families falling into these categories is a very, very significant fact, because the possibility of loss of continuity of the family and the loss of the family name stood very high. I don't think that I'm going to catch all the names for obvious reasons, because it was simply impossible, as I mentioned before, to be accurate about all these. But we do have these names. The first family was the Deeks family, 2 brothers. The next was the Edelstein family, my cousins Nat and Ray. The next were the Rubens, who, as Lionel Metrick will tell you in the next lecture, were also sort of mishpachas, sort of in the family. And the 5 Reuben brothers were all in the service. Joe and Phil Swedloff, the 3 Mossian boys, Ben, Rudy, and Abe, Sid, Sam, and Ben Shapiro, the 4 Shore brothers, Gordon, Percy, Manny, and Peter, and Ralph and Dave Benwick. Now, as I say, I may have missed some families, and I'd be happy to hear from you afterwards about any families that we didn't actually identify. Among the families that sent most or all of their eligible males, we find, the Mazer family. The Mazer family claims that they sent 7, but one was a son-in-law, so I don't know whether that's perfectly legal. But they sent 6 out of their 9 sons. The next family was the Slack family. Now, I didn't know all the Slack boys, but I think they may be all of the sons, and if anybody can tell me, I'd be happy to hear about it. Sam, Mo, Willie, and Louie. The taller brothers, Morton, Archie, and Norman, were all there. Now, as I say, forgive me if I've omitted anybody's name, but these are the ones that I wanted to identify. And these people are typical of the Jewish community. They came from all over, and they were certainly enormous contributors to our activities. Among the only sons, I'm only going to mention 3, Cy Toronto, Arnie Greenberg, and Joey Ash. Joe, unfortunately, was killed early in the war, and in fact, there's a perfect example of it. The Ash name has simply disappeared from Ottawa. Now, some of you will remember Mr. Ash, who, as I recall, worked at Freeman's. Very tall, very good-looking man, and Joe was a nice-looking boy, too. And this is the perfect example of a family which has disappeared from the Ottawa scene because he was lost during the services. Finally, we have 2 father-son combinations, which I was very interested in and very happy to hear about. Dave Doctor and his son, and Harry and Ben Asmere. There may have been other father and son combinations, but those were the only 2 that were identified. I can't pass on from the participation in the war without talking about 2 particular groups of youths in Ottawa's capital. The first was a group called the Maccabean Athletic Association. Is there anybody here that was in that group? Well, there were 18 boys in that group, and Phil Swedloff was the sort of president and managing director of it, and they operated for 2 or 3 years before the war, and when the war broke out of the 18 in the club, 15 enlisted. Not all at once because they weren't all old enough to enlist, but of the 18, 15 enlisted. This was recorded in the Ottawa Citizen of August the 2nd, 1941, and if you're interested, there's a copy of that, as Lawrence mentioned, at the back on the table. Unfortunately, the pictures aren't very good because the reproduction system isn't too great. But it was very interesting for me to read an article favorable to Jews in the Ottawa Citizen, because its reputation for being favorable to us as a people has certainly not been great in the last few years anyhow. The Canadians All booklet that I talked about earlier also referred to the AZA in Ottawa, which had a remarkable record. The AZA was a group, junior group, which was sponsored by the B'nai B'rith of Canada. At the time the war broke out, the AZA had 35 members. Of the 35 members, 17 enlisted in the first few weeks of the war, and the remainder waited until they were old enough. And out of the 35 in the club at the beginning of the war, I think the total enlistment rate, and I'm not absolutely sure, I know that it was a minimum of 26 and it may have hit 28. 80% of those young men walked into the recruiting offices and signed up. So those two groups left a name for themselves in the history of Ottawa Jewry, and I think it's important for us to know how these clubs reacted at the time. I'm not sure why we had such great participation. My own memory about enlisting was partly that it was the thing to do, and secondly, it was embarrassing to walk around in civvies very long with everybody else walking around in uniform. I don't really think that we enlisted going out to battle to die for our countries, although we were obviously expecting that this could happen. We didn't think it was going to happen. I don't think anybody went overseas or went into service thinking that they were going to die. But we all joined up for various reasons. One of the things that struck me both during the war and afterwards was that I've never found anybody that I've talked to about their enlistment who said that the reason they were joining the war was to fight Hitler. We really didn't know very much about Hitler in 1939, and it wasn't until much later that the general public began to hear about the Holocaust and the terrible fate of European Jewry. Excuse me. So that tells the story then of Ottawa Jewry and the male population of Ottawa during the war. The next is the role of the community organizations. Now, there were a lot of community organizations, such as Hadassah and so on, that did, I'm sure, do work on behalf of the servicemen. Since I was restricting my talk to what I could find in the archives and learn about from documented information, I'm only going to talk about two of the Ottawa groups. The first is the Ottawa B'nai B'rith Chapter 885, which was the only chapter at the time, and they did a great deal. They did a great deal of work in the community. They sent a lot of parcels overseas. I remember getting cigarettes from the B'nai B'rith, and it's quite possible that some of the older members, I'm thinking of Nap Kapinski, can probably recall and recount some of the stories of those days. But the booklet itself talks about some of the things that the B'nai B'rith Lodge did in Ottawa and the area. It set up the day room at Lansdowne Park, which was the Ottawa Manning Depot, equipped and furnished it, and did the same thing at a number of training centers at Camp Petawawa, which was a general training camp for very many different types of military activity. They sent cigarettes, packages, and comfort boxes to area military hospitals, and they installed radios in the military hospitals as well. They sent out entertainment units, which they organized, equipped, and financed to all military units within a 200-mile radius of Ottawa. Don Logan, who is doing research on some of the other organizations, tells me that the Ottawa Hebrew Benefit Society also was quite active in sending parcels overseas. And as a matter of fact, to make sure that this is documented, one of the letters on display at the back is from Harold Rubin, whom we all remember very well, thanking the Ottawa Hebrew Benefit Society for a carton of cigarettes which he received while he was overseas. How am I doing for time, by the way? Okay, good. The next organization that I'm going to talk about is the Ottawa Vad Ha'ir. I searched the records of the Ottawa Vad Ha'ir, and they are relatively silent on anything that they may have done directly during the war. This is not to say that they didn't do anything, it's simply that there's no written record of it that I can document well enough to include in these remarks at least. But they did take part toward the end of the war, and that was the result of letters from Captain Bert Rose, whom we all knew in the early days as Izzy Rose, Rabbi Rose, who's now in Jerusalem, and from Colonel Mervyn Mirsky, who was in Holland most of 1945 and into 1946. Mervyn Mirsky was one of the first persons to enter Bergen-Belsen, and he became very much involved with the refugees and survivors of the concentration camps who were appearing in Holland and Belgium in the early part of 1945. Both Izzy Rose and Merv Mirsky wrote to Ottawa to Rabbi Fasman, who reprinted his letters in the Ottawa Jewish Bulletin of the day, asking for support from the Ottawa Jewish community to send parcels over with anything and everything in the parcels to help the refugees and the survivors of the camps. And I must add that the papers which I got most of this information from indicate that this was general across Canada in the Jewish communities. There was a sorority at the University of British Columbia, for example, which did quite a great deal in sending parcels overseas. Hadassah groups in almost every major city were also involved, and Sam Cass, whose records I've reviewed and who is the chief chaplain for 2nd Canadian Army Corps, certainly had a great deal of correspondence with these people, and that story needs to be told, but not here. The other institution that I'm going to talk about was practically a one-person institution. I referred to this group earlier as a few of the Jewish ladies of Ottawa, but in my own opinion, and certainly it's pretty well certified by people whom I've talked to, a few of the Jewish ladies of Ottawa was the synonym for a woman whom I can only think of as a Neshit Chayil, a woman of valor, Goldie Roberts. Goldie Roberts was a widow with 3 daughters, and I'm happy to say that her oldest daughter, Molly, is in the audience with a couple of her children to hear these remarks. Goldie Roberts was a seamstress and a tailor. And very early in the war, she decided that she was going to make a particular effort on her own to support the Ottawa Jewish servicemen who were overseas. The story goes, and I take this from B'nai B'rith documents, that she made a cushion, set up a raffle for it, and raised $83, which she used to put parcels in the mail and send them overseas. And from the day she started, she never looked back. She kept on sending parcels to everyone whose name she could find, and she didn't only send parcels to the Jewish boys, she sent a number of parcels to other people, and she sent parcels for general use. She got a number of her friends, women in the community, to support her. She also enlisted the support of a few younger ladies, my wife for one. And I have to interrupt my train of thought to tell you that when I was researching Captain Cass's papers, I was reading some letters from the few of the Jewish ladies of Ottawa, and I got quite a start as I looked at these letters and realized that I recognized the handwriting. Now, I didn't know what Mrs. Roberts wrote like, but I did know what my wife wrote like. And here was my wife transcribing these letters and sending them out and signing them for Mrs. Roberts. And here I am looking at these letters with a great deal of awe and finding my wife active in Sam Cass's papers. It was really very interesting. I was also able to identify and find letters from various members of the community to Rabbi Cass, and I've passed some of those on. I passed on a couple of letters that Norman Mirsky wrote on behalf of Mrs. Roberts, because Norman got quite involved in helping her. Some of you may recall the Montefiore Club of Ottawa, and it's interesting to find out from Norman's letters that the Montefiore Club of Ottawa had begun sometime during the war, and Norman remarked with a great deal of pride that he had been able to raise $70. Now, in 1945, $70 was a fair amount of money, and he went around and simply passed his hat at the meetings and cajoled them into raising money. Other letters that I passed on were to, Becky Bauer. I found a letter from her sister Bessie, and these have given me a great deal of pleasure, and they've also been of great interest to the various families. But when we talk about Mrs. Roberts, I'd like to give you the flip side of her work, and I'm going to read you 3 letters from various servicemen to her, thanking her for the parcels. All I got to do is find my cards. These letters were transcribed by Myra Baruch, Mrs. Roberts' granddaughter, Molly's daughter, and she was kind enough to send me copies of these letters. And I should remark that not only did Mrs. Roberts get letters from the servicemen who sent her parcels, she also received 3 letters from serving generals in both the British and the Canadian Army. Auchinleck and McNaughton were 2 of them, and I hope to get transcripts of those letters as well to include in the archival records at the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. The first letter I'm going to read to you was written on Thursday, the 4th day of Tishri, 5705, corresponding to the 21st day of September 1944. And that's the way the letter starts. To the generous ladies of Ottawa, the anonymous nature of your thoughtfulness intrigues me, and I am anxious to know who is the guiding light behind it. The gesture is magnificent, and I for one want to thank you for your grand effort in keeping the boys over here happy and proving to us that we have not been forgotten by the people back home. It is not the cigarettes that pleases the boys. I can say thank you, for I enjoyed them. No, it is not that. It is the fact that you were remembered by someone back home, and even if they had sent you 1,000,000 cigarettes, the feeling is the same. I am incapable of expressing my feelings when I read to the boys the address of few of the Jewish ladies of Ottawa. That ingenious address is sufficient for me to say thank God that I am Jewish and that I have friends who remember me. God bless you, my generous lady friends. My wife won't mind, and I do hope that soon we will all be together. A Happy New Year. Signed, Sergeant Ben Kapinski. The next letter is one from a well-known member of our community, Archie Toller. Dear Mrs. Roberts, on behalf of the boys and myself at the number 5 Casualty Clearing Station who received fags from you through Major Mirsky, all I can say is thanks a million and God bless you for your kindness. Private Archie Toller. The third letter is from Mike Litwack. And as far as I can identify, and I've talked to Izzy and Sam about this, I think this was written only a few weeks before he was killed in action. Dear Mrs. Roberts, just a short note to acknowledge another shipment of cigarettes received through your kind donations. Thank you very much for the other lads from home, whom I'm certain appreciate your generosity as much as I do. Sincerely, Corporal Mike Litwack. And there are a number more, quite a number more letters at the back if you'd like to look at them. I see a number of people here who authored some of those letters, so you chaps might want to take a look at that and see them. I have tried as hard as I could to identify the few of the Jewish ladies of Ottawa. I was able to get a picture of one group of ladies who worked with Mrs. Roberts from Myra, and Rhoda Prager recently provided me with another picture. Those pictures are at the back, and so far the women whom I've been able to identify firmly are Mrs. Weisbord, Harry Weisbord's wife, Mrs. Cooper, Rhoda's mother, Mrs. Roberts herself, I think Mrs. Schinder, but I haven't been able to find anybody who can pin that particular person down, and Marvin Flatt. Now, Marvin Flatt wasn't one of the Jewish ladies of Ottawa, but I'm sure that his mother helped, and Marvin was instrumental in taking the parcels, which were quite large, and getting them to the post office to ship them overseas. As the war came to an end, and as the plight of the European Jews became evident to the Ottawa Jewish community, the Vadayir decided to go into action. The Vadayir was approached by Mrs. Roberts, who went to one of the meetings when these letters were being discussed, and the outcome of that meeting was that the VOD invited Mrs. Roberts to head a project to send parcels overseas for the refugees and the camp survivors. In one of her letters, she said to Rabbi Cass that in a period of 6 months, slightly over 6 months, she and her group had sent out over 500 parcels. Now, these weren't little wee parcels. These parcels were probably 2 or 2.5 feet wide, a foot deep, and about another 18 inches, 3 sides. They were big parcels, and you can see them in the pictures to realize just how much they contained and how much work it was. She averaged 3 parcels a day for every work day in those 6 or 7 months. So you can imagine the amount of work they put into it, not during the day, but at night. And as I say, she simply recruited, trained, and commanded this group of women whose work was a noble contribution to the Ottawa Jewish community's war efforts in general. If you read the Ottawa Jewish Bulletins, 1945 and 1946 and 47, and you examine some of the records, you'll see that Mrs. Roberts ran teas. She ran clothing drives. One of the teas in 1946 raised almost $1,000. That was a huge amount. It's a huge amount of money now. What am I talking about? It was a huge amount of money, and she put it all to good work, and she really did an enormous job. Once she completed the job that was taken over by organizations such as UNRWA and the various relief administrations in Europe, she decided that her work wasn't yet ended. She then took on the enjoyable task for her of looking after the veterans, the sick, the disabled veterans, most of whom were at the military hospital on Smythe Road. I can very well remember, and I'm sure other people who were merchants at the time remember Mrs. Roberts walking in during the summer on a nice cool Saturday afternoon, walking in the door, and I'm sure all of you did exactly what I did. We went over to the petty cash, took out $5 or $10, and then asked her what she would like for a gift for the bingo which she ran. She did this, and she was recognized by various parts of the community. She was honored for her war efforts by the veterans of Ottawa, who had a party for her, I think in late 46 or 47, at which they presented her with a tea service, which is now in Eileen's hands. Eileen is Mrs. Roberts' youngest daughter, and she treasures it, of course. She was also honored by the Ottawa chapter of Ottawa branch, of the Canadian Legion. She was made an honorary and a life member of the Canadian Legion. And as far as I'm aware, the only other woman in Canadian history who was made an honorary member of the Canadian Legion was Mrs. A.J. Freeman. But Goldie Roberts did receive that kind of recognition, and in conjunction with the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society, I'm working on a booklet which will commemorate her efforts and go into much greater detail on all the aspects of it than I can do tonight. My wife tells me I'm running out of time. We've looked at these efforts, and I think it's important to realize that the Ottawa Jewish community operated on a scale which is simply unknown to a lot of us, and it's certainly unknown to the generations that have followed. And a great part of my purpose tonight was to make sure that this kind of knowledge is passed on, and that even us who were in the service and who partook vicariously as wives and girlfriends are aware of all of these things that come together to tell a simply wonderful picture, because a wonderful story, because we can be proud of all of these things. We can be proud of our own participation among the males at the time. We can be proud of the Jewish community's participation, and we can be proud of a woman of valor, Goldie Roberts, whose outstanding work with her a few of the Jewish ladies of Ottawa deserves a very permanent record. And I hope that we will put this out sometime in the fall. And so ends my little talk. If there are any questions, I'd appreciate them identifying yourself and ashamed to admit that the statistical branch of the National Defense, Department of National Defense, simply could not provide me with a figure of separate male and female enlistments in World War II. And not only that, they did not have any figures on the religious affiliation of the enlisted population.
We have those figures, Elliott. The Ottawa Post and the Jewish.
Yes, you have the same figures I have, which are from the Canadian Jewish Congress.
Figures, excuse me, and the figures of the percentage of Jewish veterans in the Canadian Armed Forces in the Second World War.
Where did you get it from?
They are published in the bulletin of the Jewish War Veterans of Canada.
Where did they get them from?
I have no idea where they got them.
Well, the information.
They have a magazine and
Well, as I say, well, you may have figures, but I think they're probably the same ones that I used.
25%. It's some percentage greater than the national average by about 5 to 6%. Jewish enlistment in the armed forces of Canada is 5 or 6% greater than the entire manpower enlistment in the armed forces.
I'd appreciate very much getting a copy of it because, as I say, National Defense doesn't have it, so I didn't know that the Ottawa Jewish War Veterans had it. Any other questions?
Excuse me for a second.
Yeah.
We'll entertain a lot more questions, but somebody with a black Camaro has left their lights on. I thought maybe you'd want to go out and turn them off before your battery runs out. Black Camaro in the parking lot with lights on. Go ahead. Sorry.
Joel, you want another question?
Yeah, just as someone who was born after the war, I'm very proud to hear all of this and this wonderful presentation. I'm a little surprised. Why do you think the young Jewish men and women enrolled more than the average?
Well,
I had assumed it was Hitler, but you said it wasn't that.
that's my personal feeling. I don't think it was that.
Why do you think it was higher?
Well, if you want to be perfectly blunt, I know a number of fellows who were looking for a better job than they had. And the Army pay was pretty regular, and you weren't going to get fired. I'm quite serious. A lot of young Jewish fellows enlisted simply because times were tough and they couldn't get jobs. Knapp Kapinski.
You know, it's not fair to turn around and say that these boys wanted better jobs. If you take the basic result, that these Jewish boys knew what was happening to the Jews of Europe, and they're vitally interested in having everything out in the open.
Knapp, you can say that after the fact. I have never spoken to a Jewish serviceman who in 1941 or 1942 was aware of what was happening to the Jews in Europe. Just wasn't so. Not in Canada. No, they weren't. I'll simply ask, anybody who was a war veteran in World War II, ask me, hold up your hands if you volunteered because of the plight of the Jews in Europe. Anyway, there's a lot of veterans here. Did anybody do it? One? Just let me answer this. Did anybody here volunteer for service in overseas because of the plight of the Jews? Lots of servicemen here. Let me hear your answer.
I'm going to say something.
Did they know? I don't think so.
May I answer that?
Sure.
I don't think it's fair. Nobody's going to blow its own horn as to what a big deal it is. I can tell you my experience. In 1940, I was 14. And when Hitler marched into France, we were frightened. We thought that we were next on the list of extermination. I knew at 14 about what was happening in Europe. Kristallnacht was something that all Americans knew. I don't know why anybody else volunteered. I volunteered in 43 when I was in. I was 17 years old. At that time, I knew damn well what was happening. I'm not saying why or how I volunteered. I was certainly not alone. I don't think it's fair, all due respect, to make that statement.
Well, nobody said life was fair. There was somebody at a lady at the back wanted to say something.
There was a lot
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to end the discussion on that because I don't want to get into any more arguments on it. Any other questions? I'll entertain one more. I'll entertain. Won't entertain me. Again, thank you very much for your attention.
I'll have Albert Rivers come forward to thank the speaker. Albert?
With the historical societies, the Auto-Jewish Historical Society's usual efficiency, I was given a letter to read. I was given a letter to read to thank Elliott. I assumed they didn't know that I would know what to say myself, so here it goes. In appreciation for your beautiful handwriting, by the way, it looks like Shirley. In appreciation for your enlightening and excellently presented talk. That's you? Oh, listen to me. This evening.
You usually praise me, so I have no...
Wait. And for your valuable volunteer work towards our community archives, we would like you to accept this book called Hitler's Willing Executioner by Daniel Goldhagen. We don't expect it will provide any answers to you, but it will give you a new approach to the Shoah and will provide facts for your inquiring mind in appreciation and sincerity, and so on, the executives of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society. Wait. I'll tell you about Elliott, though. Elliott is one of my closest friends and has been for many years. But in retrospect, when I look back, it strikes me that one of the reasons he likes me, or did, was that my mother was a very good cook. She had excellent cookies, which my sisters and wife continued, and he was a pretty good candidate for that. We were in the fruit business, as you know, so there was always good fruits and vegetables and cream and various other things. And he did all right. Besides, I had 4 sisters and my brother, and I don't know if he learned to dance there, but he sure had a good time with all these friends that my sisters used to have over the weekends. Then we got to college. He was at university with me, and Joe Greenblatt was in the same house with a few others. And as Elliott was a few years younger, you would know by looking at him, he was the gopher. Anytime we wanted to have eat or drink at night, guess who went? The gopher. And he didn't mind because we were older, even though he was a little bit bigger. And eventually came the reunions. After 50 years, Elliott and I asked our wives to join us. No way. We went back because somehow the place wasn't quite the same. We went to the rooming house we used to live at because there were no dorms for men then. And here they were sitting around drinking beer, and there was all kinds of things going on, men and women sharing accommodations. We thought somehow or other we got gypped out of this deal. But that's life. As far as Elliott's speaking, he's always got a lot to say. And he says it well. Many times he and I don't quite agree, but it's been a wonderful friendship. He's one of the best friends I've ever had, and I hope it will be for many years. Elliott, please accept this book.
Elliott, the interest in your speech tonight is indicated by the crowd in attendance. It's one of the largest we've had in years, so I welcome and thank you all for coming. There'll be a few things to say just before we retire for food. I'd ask Mel Goldberg to come forward while I'm making a couple statements. I would ask the daughter, I'm sure, I don't know who she is or who they are. by the daughter of Goldie Roberts and her 2 grandchildren. Would they stand and be acknowledged by the audience? Family. Sons. Certainly commendable. And those were the good old days of the small Jewish community in Ottawa. I also would like to welcome any checks that you have with regards to payments of dues. And since we have such a large audience, I'm sure you would probably want to join the society. It's not expensive whatsoever, but you can see Bertha Leckie, and she's on the side of the hall at the back. You're also welcome to take a look at the display that Don Logan has on display on behalf of the society for the speech tonight. Mel Goldberg is asked to say a few words. Mel.
This has nothing to do for the good evening. This has nothing to do with the evening. I want to thank Elliott for a very interesting and wonderful presentation. But I'm here to tell you that old soldiers never die, and they don't even fade away. And we, the Ottawa Post of the Jewish War Veterans of Canada, are having our 6th annual dinner on Tuesday, the 21st of May at Matzigi Hadass. We will have as our guest speaker the Minister Counselor of the Israeli Embassy, Eli Yerushalmi, and as well, gracing the head table, and who will also speak, is Mr. Norman Spector, Canada's former ambassador to Israel, who may have some interesting observations to make as well. It is open to the public, and any of you who are interested can contact Arnold Greenberg, who will be happy to hold you in reserve. We have room for a few people, and I can assure you it will be the most stimulating and the most military evening you may see for some time. Thank you very much.
Elliott, I also want to pass along my word of commendation for this evening, because the crowd came out not to hear me or the society, but you, and it's in your honor that they are here. I wish to thank you all for coming, and have a good evening. There's food at the back of the hall. Enjoy yourself. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good? Did I meet your expectations?
You referred to the Jewish boys that are doing the jobs, yes.
So this is all service.
Why wasn't the Coptic family for poor people?